Welcome everyone to our next CED webinar series event entitled Clinical Engineering Cybersecurity, Fundamentals for Global Clinical Engineers. Today, we'll address the first of two sessions with CED collaborator Axel Worth, and we'll continue with the second one on Thursday with Priyanka Upendra. After this session, we'll send you an email with the link you'll be using to join the second session, which does not require registration. You will also get the links for the materials, recordings, and after the second webinar is over. Without further ado, thank you for tuning in, and I give you Axel Worth. Take it away, Axel.
Thank you, Louis, and thank you to GCA and IFMB for inviting me here to this webinar on what I consider a very important topic, which is cybersecurity in the medical device ecosystem and as it relates to the clinical engineering profession. As Louis already said, this is a two-part series. I will provide a general introduction and talk about cybersecurity fundamentals, and then on Thursday, Priya will dive in deeper in the hospital and clinical engineering side of the problem. Please use the Q&A feature if you have any questions prior to the discussion at the end of the session today. So we're briefly going to talk about stakeholders and general trends in cybersecurity, then talk about changes on how healthcare is changing and how that impacts and is impacted by cybersecurity, talk a little bit about the technical side on how you actually can improve security, and then in the end have a little bit of time for discussion and questions. So really, who are the main stakeholders? And even though the topic cybersecurity for medical devices is fairly narrow, the range of stakeholders, on the other hand, is quite broad, right? You have government and the general public, so those could be policy and lawmakers, regulators, but also even patient privacy advocacy groups or groups that represent certain types of patients. Then you have government cyber defense, and basically their role is to provide legal and tactical frameworks to assure safety and effectiveness of the medical device ecosystem and reduce the risk of cyber harm. Then, of course, you have the operators of devices, and I assume that most on the call today will fall into that category. So that includes IT and IT security. It includes clinical engineering. It also includes providers of care services. So if you think, for example, about telehealth, there's typically a care service provider that provides the telehealth service to the patients and the hospitals, and they certainly have a stake in cybersecurity as well, as these operators of devices typically are deeply involved in the acquisition and maintenance and need to make sure that the devices are sufficiently protected against cyber compromise so that patient safety is assured and reliability of the delivery of care is assured. And we'll talk about both of those aspects in more detail later. Then, of course, you have users of devices, and that can be anything from doctors or nurses, other clinical specialists that may use devices, but also the patients themselves or caregivers to patients that may use connected devices in the patient's home. And certainly their objective is to assure patient safety and make sure that the devices perform as intended and are reliable in achieving the desired diagnostic and therapeutic results. And then lastly, you have manufacturers of devices, and that includes the original equipment manufacturers as well as suppliers, vendors, importers, and so forth. So a range of roles there, and basically their objective is to design, release, and distribute safe, secure, and effective devices that meet your local regulations and are also safe for the user and the operator of the device. Now, why across those four categories is cybersecurity important? So, for example, you work in the public service or in government, and you want to, for example, establish regional cybersecurity guidances and frameworks as more and more countries are doing right now. You want to educate technical and non-technical stakeholders within your region and your country. You want to, for example, develop a national testing and market approval regimen. So, for example, when do you consider a device safe enough to be introduced into your markets, which include cybersecurity? And then lastly, you're developing government health policies that need to be security aware, as in, for example, many governments are right now working on telehealth policies. And in my opinion, we can't do that without considering cybersecurity. If you're an operator of a device, you may be involved in projects like making sure that your procurement process and your contracting is considerate and aware of security. You're deploying devices, you operate devices, you maintain devices, which includes security. You engage with other stakeholders in the process, so you all need to make sure you speak the same language. And you want to minimize the risk of patient harm and minimize the risk of your care operations and care delivery. Then as a user, you may be assured that the device you're using or that is being used on you is sufficiently secure, right? As a patient, for example, you want to trust the device that you're using. You want to make sure that the risk of harm, the risk of care disruption, or even a privacy compromise is sufficiently assured. Potentially, you may even have some basic maintenance task if you, for example, operate the device in your home. And then lastly, you want to prevent security obsolescence of devices that you are purchasing. You want to make sure that they are indeed secure for the future. As a manufacturer, you want to make sure that you meet regulatory and compliance requirements with regards to safety and effectiveness and cybersecurity. You also have business interests, as in, for example, you want to protect your market share and maintain market relevance. You want to prevent business losses and lawsuits, and you want to prevent reputational damage. So again, across those four categories, you want to make sure that whatever project you undertake, and there's quite a spectrum here, that you consider security appropriately. Now, looking at the other side now, at the cyber adversaries, hackers and others, but we need to understand that today's threats are quite different than the threats of only 5 or 10 years ago. So we went from, I really apologize, I have a dry spot. You really want to make sure that you understand that adversaries today have changed from individual hackers over sophisticated cyber criminals to hackers for hire and even nation states. You want to make sure you understand their motivation, right? It used to be the early hackers wanted to be famous. They just wanted to be known as being a better hacker than others. But that then changed when cyber criminals were in it for the money. And then certainly nation states had political goals, even up to the point of engaging in cyber warfare. Targets have changed, right? It used to be individual computers or the information on computers. It now has changed to the larger infrastructures within our communities, and even entire societies and economies can be attacked. So the objective went from the early day hackers, they were in it for intellectual stimulation, to now a business-driven underground economy of stolen goods, of services, espionage and sabotage, as well as subversion and destruction potentially. So I'll give you two examples on what attacks look like today. Late 2020, we had a software supplier company by the name of SolarWinds have some of their products compromised in an attack that Microsoft calls the largest and most sophisticated attack the world has ever seen. And there was a specific piece of malware that was inserted in SolarWinds network management software. and it infected US government agencies, even cybersecurity vendors, and a total of an estimated of 18,000 organizations across the globe. And most interesting, Microsoft at times had assigned 500 engineers to investigate this attack and coordinate a response against this attack. But from analyzing the attack, they actually estimated that it was created by a team of twice the size, so at least 1,000 people were involved in the development of this attack, which means only a very large cybercriminal organization or a government can pull off this type of a coordinated and well-planned type of attack. A more recent example, in fact, from just a few days ago, is an attack that happened in Costa Rica for the last couple of months. The Conti ransomware group hijacked several government agencies, including the Finance Ministry, Ministry of Science, the Meteorological Institute, the Social Security Fund. They stole and have published 672 gigabytes of data, basically to extort the government. And the incoming president, one of the first things he had to do on May 8th, just a few days ago, he had to declare a national emergency because of a cyber attack. So that gives you, I think, an idea on how sophisticated attacks are today, SolarWinds on the left, but also how impactful they can be. Costa Rica is an example on the right, where literally a cyber attack on government institutions has led to the declaration of a national emergency. A couple of other examples on how quickly cyber criminals can shift their business model and can find new ways of making money. So for example, ransomware attacks now provide you call center or online chat support. So just in case you can't figure out on how to pay the ransom, you can actually chat with an online support representative who then can help you figure out how to make the payment. On the right-hand side, another example. This was an attack on a hospital chain of psychiatric hospitals in Finland, where they not only tried to extort the hospital themselves, but also the patients whose records they got a hold of. And this being a psychiatric hospital, obviously, those records could contain quite sensitive information, and they tried to make additional money from the patients in addition to extorting just the hospital. So again, cyber criminals are very quick in developing better ways of making more money through their attacks. Another thing we have learned is that anytime that we face a new challenge for the adversaries, it is a new opportunity, and we have seen that most recently in the COVID-19 outbreak, the global pandemic, where we have seen compromise of confidentiality. In this example, hackers actually stealing patients' COVID-19 data and test results and vaccination status. We have seen compromise on integrity, where hackers have been reported to compromise vaccine clinical trial results, so because they wanted to impair public trust in vaccine research. And then lastly, impact on availability of services, including coronavirus testing and information services provided by the World Health Organization. So again, an example on how quickly adversaries can shift and how quickly they develop new business models and jump and monetize the challenges we are facing. So cybersecurity is an arms race, but we invent new defenses and the attackers invent new ways to compromise us. That is certainly true for any type of new technology we are inventing. For example, artificial intelligence and machine learning, which we are certainly using in healthcare, and we're certainly using in cybersecurity for our defenses, but we've also seen attackers trying to corrupt AI-based business systems to their advantage, or use AI-powered toolkits and services to develop more sophisticated and quicker attacks, or use AI to develop highly realistic deepfakes or disinformation campaigns that are almost impossible to distinguish from an original. Another technology example is 5G networks, right, which for us certainly has many many advantages. For example, the provision of rural healthcare services, but it also expands our attack surface as attackers being able now to circumvent traditional enterprise networks and attack directly using a 5G connection as a bridgehead for an attack. They can also launch data in motion attacks, data that is traveling across networks, and they can attack the availability of networks in general and therefore compromise our infrastructure. Then we have seen a lot of attacks on operational technology, as in, for example, the Colonial Pipeline, which affected gasoline availability on the US East Coast a couple of months ago, or attacks on IoT type devices, including IoT devices used in healthcare. We have seen IoT devices being used to launch very high volume denial of service or short DDoS attacks. And we have seen attacks on critical infrastructure, pipelines, dams, water treatment facilities, electrical grid. And we have seen the potential to even turn such an attack into a kinetic attack, meaning an attack that can actually do physical damage. Lastly, as we in our technology world depend more and more on our supply chain for software, for products, for components we buy, we have seen much more attacks on these supply chains by, for example, delivering a payload via a trusted partner. And the SolarWinds attack we just talked about is a perfect example for that. And then also in the future, we need to be prepared for a potential of a hardware-based attack vector, meaning that a compromise, a piece of malware is not only embedded in software, it may actually be embedded in computer or memory chips we're buying, which basically makes them impossible to eradicate because they are baked into the hardware. So no wonder that organizations like, for example, the ACRI Institute have now called on the healthcare industry to be aware of cybersecurity, and they have included cybersecurity risks since 2015 now in their annual top 10 health technology hazards. And in 2022, the most recent report that came out, it even ended up on the #1 spot as a risk to the healthcare industry and the risk to patient safety. So if we're building a cybersecurity program, where do we start and how do we do it? Well, it all starts at the top right with business leadership. We need to make sure that whoever leads a business, doesn't matter whether you are a manufacturer of devices, if you're providing services, or if you're operating a hospital or other health service, you need to understand that your cyber risk is a business risk. You need to have broad support for board and executive leadership, establish a culture of security, and provide staffing and budget for it. You want to establish the right objectives. You want to make sure you establish governance and define what your organization's risk tolerance is. And you want to look at any new technology you're adopting, include the security aspect of that technology. It doesn't matter whether you're moving data to the cloud, adapting mobile devices, telehealth, artificial intelligence. Any of these new technologies cannot be successfully adopted without considering cybersecurity. And then lastly, your business decision-making needs to include cybersecurity as you receive reports from your organization, as you audit, as you manage change, as you assess the status of your business and look for gaps you need to fill. You need to include and understand cybersecurity. Now, on a more strategic level, if you are in IT, in information security, clinical engineering, and similar roles, you need to understand that your technical roles now need to include cybersecurity, and even non-technical roles like clinicians and administrators, need to incorporate cybersecurity as appropriate for the role in their daily tasks. You need to understand the relevant regulations, laws, and frameworks. You need to conduct a risk-based approach to security. You need to understand cybersecurity, privacy, and patient safety impacts of any security compromise, and develop the correct policies and procedures to support that. The security tactics, obviously, you need to be able to execute on security fundamentals, protect devices, manage devices, protect your networks, and respond to incidents. You have basic housekeeping in place, know what is on your network, prioritize remediation, manage configurations, segment your networks, manage your vendors. And then lastly, you want to have cybersecurity operations in place that provides you with the right threat intelligence, security management, identity management, whoever accesses your systems, event monitoring, and incident response. And many of those we'll talk in a moment. So now I'm going to dive into some of the technicalities around cybersecurity to give you a little bit of a background and to also familiarize you with some of the concepts and terminology we're using, so that when you engage across stakeholders or when you engage in writing government policy or organizational procedures, you use the right concepts and the right terminology. So we already touched on this, right? Our medical device ecosystem is security challenged. The devices we use are complex and they live a long time. They were designed before we had today's high sophisticated cyber threats. There's also a high degree of dependencies of devices on other devices and other infrastructure, which makes upgrade and replacement difficult. So we have a very large, what we call legacy burden, and a very large security debt, because, as I said a moment ago, devices we're using were not designed for today's cyber threats. The adversaries are changing, right? Sophisticated threats, increased skill and motivation, and we now see criminals and also political motivation as part of the attack. Societal awareness and also societal dependency is higher. Critical infrastructure, we depend on our healthcare system to function. We depend on our electrical grid to function. Regulators are looking at cybersecurity, but also so is the press, so are patients, so is the general public. And we are looking at a changing care delivery model where we move care into patients' home, and that needs to be aware and conscious of cybersecurity as well. So to sum it up, we live in a world of increasing cyber risk due to targeted attacks, collateral damage risk, integrity and availability of not only data, but also devices is at risk, as well as privacy and confidentiality. So it's a very broad spectrum of threats we are facing and we need to manage. So why is it so hard to secure healthcare? And there are many reasons. I'm just giving a couple of examples here. So for example, security may conflict with care delivery. It may impact the usability, the ease of access, or the user acceptance of devices or software solutions. Healthcare is not known for streamlined decision-making, but decision-making in healthcare can be very complex, very slow. We tend to be conservative. We also want to stay on the safe side of decisions. And it's a very political environment, all of which we can understand working in the healthcare industry, but we also need to understand that it is counterproductive to nimble security. We also have a high disparity of technology platforms that is driven by, for example, preference of clinicians of certain departments, or what vendors mandate. But they may mandate a certain hardware platform or a certain operating system, or they may hold you back in terms of changing and upgrading. And then certainly we have a lot of regulatory mandates that also slow down change, which again is the opposite of a nimble approach that we would need in cybersecurity. Historically and culturally, healthcare has been a compliance-driven industry. Here in the US, we have HIPAA. In Europe, we have GDPR. And many, many other countries have various laws that regulate the overall compliance structure of data privacy, for example, in cybersecurity, but that is not the same as being secure, right? We have plenty of examples of organizations that spend a lot of money in becoming compliant, but then were breached shortly after because they didn't anticipate the latest type of cyber threats in their compliance-based approach to cyber security. And then lastly, healthcare has for a long time underinvested in cybersecurity. We see that change now, but there's also significant catch-up we need to do. We have seen historically, and again, we see that change now, a lack of board and executive leadership on cybersecurity. And yes, we're moving forward. I think a good example on the situation in healthcare is the photo on the right, where a policeman placed the boot on an ambulance. But certainly from a compliance perspective, it was the right thing to do, right? The ambulance was in a no parking zone. But from a care delivery perspective, it has negative impact because now that ambulance can't transport patients. That is a kind of humorous and maybe trivial example, but that gives you an indication how many times in healthcare we need to balance compliance and security measures against care delivery. And that is not an easy balance to find. A couple of concepts and terminology. So we talk about cyber risk. And in order to have a risk, we need three components. We need to have a threat, a vulnerability, and an asset, right? And only if we have all three components, we do have a risk. Then we apply what we call risk controls to reduce the risk, leaving us with an acceptable residual risk. This calls for a formal approach to risk management where we formally assess, again, our threats, the vulnerabilities in our systems, and the value of the assets we're protecting. And assets can be both tangible, things like computer and data and money, but they can also be intangible, things like your reputation or patients' trust in your organization or patient safety. And in risk management, we try to reduce these components so that we have an acceptable residual risk. And so here's the general definition of what risk is, and that's the potential for an unwanted or adverse outcome resulting from an incident, in our word here, a cyber incident. Then we apply risk controls, but we mitigate by, for example, reducing the probability of occurrence or the severity of harm. Or we implement a contingency, which reduces the consequence, meaning the severity. Data backup, for example, is a good example for contingency. You're not changing the probability. You are as probable for being attacked, but if you're attacked, you can restore your data because you have a backup, so you have reduced severity. A network firewall would be an example for reducing probability because you make it less likely of an attacker breaching your network. We can also transfer risk, for example, through insurance, or we can accept risk if it is sufficiently low. We apply risk mitigation, which means we use one or more measures to reduce the probability of an unwanted occurrence and lessen the consequences. So the implementation of appropriate risk reduction controls based on risk management priorities and the analysis of alternatives. Then we have the concept of a asset. And again, as I said earlier, asset can be specific, patient safety, it can be money, data, information that is valuable to us. And these assets are contained within a larger system or a single device or a larger network. It's just conceptual here, so we're not going to get into any of those details. Then we have threats. We talked about those earlier. They are basically attacking us from the outside. and we are well protected unless we introduce a vulnerability, a weakness in our system. Should such a weakness be exploited, the vulnerability be exploited, we call it an attack vector. And the attack vector is compromised by what we call an exploit, which can be a hacker, a piece of malware, somebody compromising and stealing login credentials. They all can be part of an exploit, and typically exploits require multiple components and multiple steps. If we detect an attacker active on the inside, we call it a security event. And should that event compromise an asset, we talk about an incident. So those are somewhat abstract terms here, but I want to make sure that everybody is familiar with these basic concepts. As I said earlier, it doesn't matter whether you are actually writing policies for your government, security policies, or whether you are writing procedures for your hospital. You need to use the right terminology and apply the right concepts. Then we have the threat landscape, which is basically a general term that describes the adversaries, the methods they're using, the tools, and the trends we're seeing, new malware being developed, new attack groups being formed, new methods they are applying, and so forth. And then we can estimate the risk by looking at the probability of occurrence and the impact severity of the event should it occur, right? And that gives us an estimation of risk. And I don't want to get into details here. There are many methodologies that can be used to do so. But I think the key is here that in cybersecurity, the term probability is very tricky because we really many times don't have historic data, right? If somebody writes a new piece of malware and releases it tomorrow, we have no statistical historic data about this piece of malware because it didn't exist before. Therefore, in cybersecurity, we introduce the concept of exploitability and say, yeah, the probability of an event occurring is based on how exploitable, for example, a vulnerability is. How easy would it be to attack an organization? Do I have to be on the network? Can I be remote? Do I have to have physical control of the device? Or can I execute it, for example, through a wireless attack and so forth? So exploitability is a more useful concept, I think, in cybersecurity than statistical probability based on historic experience. I don't want to go through details here. These are just the terms I just walked through. They're going to be in the handout for your benefit. A couple of examples, though, of cyber incidents and the scope of cyber events we have observed in healthcare. For example, these two cybersecurity research companies, Greenbone and CyberAngel, they both demonstrated that medical images are exposed and can be actually publicly accessed. And they have actually globally found millions of directly accessible PACS systems and PACS archives with billions of individual images. So clearly hundreds of institutions had their data exposed, which is obviously very concerning. Here another example, a study done by a company by the name of name of TrapX. They call this type of an attack MedJack, where basically a hacker group had identified medical devices as a hiding point and as a launch point for a beachhead attack. So the medical device was not the target, but they used the medical device to bring malware into the hospital and then launch a malware attack on more valuable systems, financial systems and others from the medical devices. And that is what we call a beachhead attack. And again, we have evidence through security researchers like TrapX, but also other organizations that indeed we have seen these type of attacks in practice. Here is an analysis, a very good article, how a cloud-based radiotherapy planning service was impacted back in 2021 that compromised sensitive data of about 200,000 patients and impacted about 42 sites that were using linear accelerators to treat cancer patients and disrupting the treatment of those patients. And clearly a high impact kind of scenario, high severity scenario, because it compromised the care for patients that were undergoing cancer treatment, and radiotherapy is particularly vulnerable because it is such a sensitive type of therapy device that is so important to patients receiving that type of therapy, and any delay obviously will result in compromised oncology care and will long-term impact patient survival. So if we look at medical devices and medical device cybersecurity, we certainly need to look at a number of security risks. We need to look at patient safety, and it doesn't matter whether the safety is compromised because of an intentional or unintentional attack. We need to look at risk to care delivery. Doesn't matter whether it is downtime due to system availability and impact on hospital operations. We need to look at privacy, breach of protected health information, of personal information, of network or user credentials, financial data. We need to look at the risk of the device itself being an attack vector. That's the example we just looked at, the beachhead attack. But we also need to look at business and financial risk, but your reputation as a device manufacturer, your reputation as a hospital, and any compromise, any attack could result in reputational harm, revenue loss, lawsuits, fines. If you're publicly traded, could impact your stock value. And then lastly, we have a number of indirect risks we need to deal with, including things like patient trust, patient treatment decisions, staff morale, and even national security. So the spectrum of risks we need to look at in the medical device space is quite broad and quite complex. We also need to understand the difference between business critical systems and mission critical systems versus life critical systems. Right. So if we look at confidentiality, yes, that is things like patient health data, identities, account information, billing, payment data, intellectual property, contracts, HR documents, identities, and so forth. Availability is certainly the availability of clinical systems, your electronic record system, your specialty care system, your PACS, your lab, your e-prescription system, certainly medical devices that are directly tied to the availability of clinical services, as we've seen in the radiation oncology example a moment ago. And then your business systems, right? Email, for example, a lot of business functions and even clinical functions depend on email exchange of information, your financial systems, your scheduling systems. And then we have integrity, certainly integrity of critical patient data, your prescriptions, your medications, your allergy history, diagnostic therapy data, even alarm data. But there's also critical patient data, things like, for example, device calibration, safety limits of devices, and then functionality and reliability issues that could lead to patient harm as well. So certainly, if we look at confidentiality and availability risks, you're talking about your patients and your staff's experience, and yes, their trust in you as an organization. But both availability and integrity can actually lead to patient harm, right? And that is where we talk about life-critical patient safety risks, right? Availability, because certain systems may not be available. And certainly integrity, if, for example, patient receives the wrong dosage or medication. So even though they're all cyber risks that relate to healthcare and span across confidentiality, availability, and integrity, their impact, their broad impact is quite different, and we need to understand that type of an impact. I want to switch topics now and talk about today's care spectrum. So as we already mentioned earlier, right, a lot of care today is moving out of the hospital, and that is in part driven through aging population, which is true here in the US, true in Europe, true in Asia, true on any other continent, right? But also patient preference. We have now a digital patient. They buy their own devices that measure their blood oxygen level and monitor certain basic cardiac functions. We've seen the consumerization of health technology, and that technology is now broadly available, like your smartwatch, your fitness tracker, your smart bathroom scale, your home blood pressure cuff that is connected to your smartphone. So those are all good things, right? They help us to diversify care delivery and reduce cost. It also has led to a relaxation of certain regulations to enable this type of care delivery, and something that was before COVID not possible, that, for example, a doctor or hospital received the same level of reimbursement for telehealth service now since COVID-19, as we try to keep patients out of hospitals, is now in place, right? We now receive the same reimbursement for telehealth services as we used to for traditional in-person services, at least here in the US, that is the case now. And I assume in many other countries as well. So if you look at the care spectrum, on the left-hand side, you now have the patient's home that has a multitude of devices, and some that measure from a patient directly, some that require the patient to enter data into a data collection tool. There is typically a telehealth platform provider in the middle that then routes the data to the care provider, to the doctor or the hospital. And there's a great white paper that was published here in the US by our National Institute of Standards and Technology on how to secure these type of telehealth ecosystems. And the link is going to be here in the handout for you to download this, this white paper. So telehealth is good. Telehealth helps us, helps our patients, helps reduce cost, but we need to be rolling it out in awareness of security risks and with the proper security protection. We clearly understand now, after 2 years of dealing with the pandemic, that telehealth indeed can enhance patient safety because it prevented delays, right? You could talk to your doctor on, via an online service rather than risking exposure or delaying seeing your doctor in the hospital. We now are adding AI and machine learning tools to detect fraud, but also come up with better diagnosis. So basically, telehealth should be held to the same standards of care quality as in-person care, but we need to make some adoptions. We need to be realistic that there is a difference between face-to-face via computer and face-to-face in an office. But the availability of telehealth services has demonstrably not resulted in excess cost by through abuse of it, except in some areas of telebehavioral health, where indeed utilization has increased, but then at the same time, we also went through a time of very high stress due to the pandemic. So there was a higher need of telebehavioral health services, which then led to an increase in cost. But overall, this report here concludes that telehealth indeed has decreased net cost and has helped to improve outcomes, especially in this crisis situation. So the recommendation here is that policymakers should indeed make permanent changes by lifting geographic restrictions, by allowing telehealth for various types of clinical conditions, by acknowledging that telehealth visits can meet the requirements of quality care, and by eliminating unnecessary restrictions across state lines by in regions that have a state-by-state regulated healthcare system, as we have, for example, here in the US. But what is also interesting, and that goes back to my previous point, that our challenges are the cyber attackers' opportunity. Right? So this is in the early days of 2020, when we all remember how in March and April, the pandemic took off and impacted our our lives, including our ability to see care providers. And that also resulted, interesting enough, with an increase of telemedicine companies being mentioned in the dark web, in the underground economy. So clearly, cyber adversaries were detecting that the shift to telemedicine was an opportunity for them and started discussing on how they could compromise telehealth companies. And the frequency of mentioning of specific company names went up as we entered the early days of the pandemic. So switching back now a little bit to technical stuff, common security controls, but how do we actually address now the challenges we're facing? And it's always across three pillars. The first being people. Develop cybersecurity culture, train, put it in your contracts, practice cyber hygiene, have appropriate budgets and staffing, and have interdisciplinary teams in place that can perform not only your clinical tasks, but also can augment with security knowledge. And then lastly, develop external relationships with vendors across the industry, with law enforcement, government, and so forth. Then the second pillar is process, right? Your governance, your policies, your forms, your procurement, your contracting, all should be inclusive of cybersecurity. You should have a cybersecurity specific risk management process in place, and you should manage cybersecurity as part of your device's lifecycle. And then lastly, technology can help, right? There are risk management tools, there are asset management tools that are commercially available that can help you reduce complexity and improve those very complex tasks. Build a secure network architecture, segment your network. Build good security into your network components, your firewalls, your gateways, and other systems. Use passive network monitoring tools that monitor your network traffic and detect abnormal traffic, as for example, all of a sudden your MRI scanner doesn't connect to the manufacturer of the MRI scanner anymore, but to a totally different IP address in another country. Clearly, you know that that is not a normal service access, and you should be able to detect these kind of events automatically. Then put endpoint protection, antivirus on devices that can take endpoint protection. And I understand that there are limitations. Encrypt data at rest and in motion. Have good media management rules in place, like your USB thumb drives, for example, and then use security orchestration and response tools, because one of the challenges we have is indeed the complexity of security, that many times our security ecosystem by itself has gotten so complex that humans cannot possibly manage it without the support of at least semi-automatic tools. So we talk about the 4 security tenets here. Basically protect the device, and that starts with the design, the implementation of cryptography, cyber hygiene, incoming inspection, right? You want to make sure that the device you're buying is A, fulfilling the security requirements you established, and B, is not, for example, introducing malware on the device, as I've heard reports that has happened. Integrate it in a secure manner on a secure network. Then you want to protect the ecosystem, provides certainly remote access to your manufacturers, but it has to be secure, two-factor authentication ideally. Secure your cloud, provide security documentation like software bill of material and the manufacturer disclosure statement for medical device security, short MDS2, enable and train your staff, detect anomalies, use firewalls, gateways, and train your staff. Manage devices across their life cycle and through implementation of changes, including changes to support security. Disclose and process vulnerabilities, manage your supply chain, put security in your contracts, plan for replacement, and then engage in asset and dependency management so that devices are known, are secure, manage your risk, mitigate your risk, and maintain your security posture. And then lastly, respond to incidents, right? Understand the threats, understand the vulnerabilities of your devices. Be prepared to detect, respond, recover, collect forensic data so you can learn from it, make the right decisions should an incident occur, and communicate and report as needed. And I want to specifically pick out incident response because that is such an important but unfortunately often neglected task. Right? So you start with preparation, incident response plan, define roles and responsibilities, and then you want to train and practice. The last thing you want to do is start executing your plan the first time you have a real incident. So you want to have tabletop exercises. You want to be able to detect and correctly describe and characterize an incident. You want to be able to escalate depending on the impact. And you want to make sure that while you do all of that, you collect the forensic data so you can analyze it once you're recovered. You want to, of course, contain it as good as you can. You want to eradicate it, right? Restore devices, restore services, then enter the final recovery phase, which is returning to full normal state, document and report what happened internally, and depending on the impact, for example, if patient safety was at risk, you also may have to report externally. And then as a follow-up, when everything is calmed down again, perform your forensic analysis, assess your own response, and look at areas where you can improve, and then feed those lessons learned back into your incident response plan to make it better for the next time. So that's it. That's a wrap for today. We have about 8 minutes left for questions, so we can unmute the lines, or you can type questions in the Q&A. So somebody put something in the chat here about how can we mitigate an attack that comes from one of the stakeholders, right? That is what we typically refer to as an insider attack. And those are certainly very difficult to mitigate because you have a person that is on your network, has your trust, has an account on your network and can access. So that makes it very tricky. There are tools out there that can help you to monitor employee behavior and flag, for example, if somebody starts copying or accessing data that they shouldn't be copying or accessing. So there's certainly a number of tools you can apply, but I think in the end, it comes down also to training, because many times these insiders do bad things, not because they are malicious, just because they didn't consider the cybersecurity consequences of what they're doing. So certainly training goes a long way, but then also tools that you can use to monitor employee behavior. Is there any way we can evaluate our hospital against cyber threats? Certainly, there are ways you can establish, right? You can, for example, hire a security consultant, a company that would assess your security posture, would look for potential exposed data, look for potential weak spots, run a vulnerability scan. You can use tools to run scans against devices on your network. Just be careful with medical devices. Not all medical devices like these kind of vulnerability scans that are automatically performed. But yeah, there's I think a long list of things that you can do that would indeed help. And one of the things I said in the very beginning, and I think that is important, is that, yeah, you have certain technical tasks, including assessing your security posture, but you also need to report up to management. But you need to say where your weaknesses are. You need to explain where your risks are. So certainly a number of things that that can be done and should be done. Looking at the Q&A regarding to cybersecurity awareness, share two aspects to take into account. to improve board decision-making stakeholders' understanding. LMICs face relevant challenges on confidentiality and accessibility to address risk. Is an example of a successful response from an LMIC country. So first of all, let me reassure you that problem you're describing is not limited to LMIC. I see it even here in the US, I see it in Europe, where many times cybersecurity programs fail because they don't get leadership support, they don't get board or executive decision maker support and budgets to implement a good cybersecurity program. I think one way that is effective is to have to make sure that cybersecurity becomes a regular topic in your board meetings, in your executive meetings, where somebody from your security department on a regular basis reports on security events that happen in your organization, but also security events that were published by organizations across the globe, by your government, by threat intelligence organizations, by the press, by people like me, so that you understand what is happening and what the impact is on patient care, on the business. And what I've seen is that if you establish that regular type of reporting, then eventually your board will understand A, what their risk is, but also what their responsibility is. What kind of questions should we ask vendors to ensure their systems will not be host of cyber malware that could later on spread on our network? Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, that is a very curious case, which you would think should not happen, but I've heard several reports of it happening, that hospitals buy new medical devices or medical devices return from repair and they got infected by malware. The device gets connected to the network and then spreads malware. So a couple of things you can do is certainly in the contract spell out the manufacturers or the repair services responsibilities of assuring malware-free delivery of devices. And then secondly, when the device comes back, before you put it on your production network, put it on a test network that is tightly scanned for security events, right? And that is, firewalled off from the rest of your hospital network, so you can observe the device and see if anything unusual happens that would indicate potentially malware on a device. I've seen many hospitals that are doing these kind of things. So we're coming to the top of the hour. I take one more that was just entered here. Is it possible to have an attack to a non-communicating medical device? So I assume you mean with that a medical device that is not on your network. Unfortunately, the answer is yes. It is less likely, but I have seen attacks that were delivered by, for example, thumb drives, where somebody wants to install data on the device or install an update or take data off a device on a thumb drive, and that thumb drive includes malware and infects the device. And then it may infect the device or the subnet if the device is operated on an island. You may remember from many years ago the Stuxnet attack on the Iranian nuclear facility. That was actually such an attack, an air-gapped attack via a thumb drive. There was a subnetwork that was not connected to the external internet. Therefore, it was deemed safe. Therefore, the operators were more casual and didn't install operating system updates and other things you would typically do. And it was actually possible to introduce the malware via a service technician with a thumb drive. And I've heard similar reports from US hospitals as well. The difference being, in case of Stuxnet, it was a nation state attack and it was a very well planned and deliberate attack. Whereas the cases I've seen here in US hospitals, it was more a traveling service technician, that works at airports, hospitals, and picked up a piece of malware, and then introduces it at the next hospital he or she stops. So it was more coincidental, non-targeted, but nevertheless had the same consequences. And with that, it's a wrap. We're at the top of the hour. Louis, Judd, I'm not sure if you have any closing comments. If you capture the chat and the Q&A, I can then respond to a couple of more questions by email and make them available to the participants. Thanks everybody for joining today, and thanks for your time.